I have your attention, please? We will begin our session on understanding North Korea. Necessities and constraints will begin shortly. Please return to your seat. And please be sure to put your cell phone into silence mode. The session provides simultaneous interpretation. If you want to use the device, you can use simultaneous interpretation. Korean channel 4 and English channel 5. For those of you who are attending this forum from online, you can select the language that you want on YouTube. So now let us begin our session. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is JEJU. I'm the MC of the today's session.
Before starting the session, we have a video clip prepared by the Institute for National Security Strategy.
Now, we will have President Kim of Institute for National Security Strategies for his opening remarks. 여러분 안녕하십니까?
Kim, I'm the president of the Institute for National Security Strategy. I welcome you to our session. I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to all the distinguished experts from home and abroad who are participating in this JEJU forum session. This session and 2 more sessions tomorrow will be hosted by INSS. If it weren't for the COVID-19, we would have hosted you in JEJU. Maybe we could provide you this island's natural beauty as a gift. So we regret much that we could not to do so. This year, the Institute is hosting 3 sessions under the theme of Understanding North Korea. North Korea is located in a close geographical proximity to the Republic of Korea. And even before the division, we were a single nation sharing the same history and the same culture. And yet, North Korea, DPRK, remains largely incomprehensible, even to the Koreans in the South. However, we must not stop our efforts to understanding North Korea. Only by understanding North Korea, we can identify an appropriate approach toward the DPRK, and only on that basis we can achieve workable and sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula. Today is June 25th. 71 years ago, in 1950, the Korean War broke out. This war is still ongoing, and complete peace lies far beyond our reach. The war is incomplete, and so is our peace. DPRK, which invaded South Korea 71 years ago, is still a fearsome nation threatening peace on the Korean Peninsula. We have yet to design a path toward peace and the denuclearization on the peninsula. At this moment in time, it is difficult to provide the bright outlook regarding the internal situation in North Korea. As the regime itself had admitted, last year was a challenging time for North Korea. Because of the international sanctions and COVID-19, storms and the flooding, their situation does not seem to have improved much this year. For instance, a 3rd plenary session of the 8th Party Central Committee held on June 15th, the Secretary Kim Jong-un urged the need for countermeasures, acknowledging that the food crisis in North Korea was getting worse. Many experts outside North Korea agreed that North Korea must improve its worsened external relations if they hope to fundamentally overcome its current challenges. However, North Korea does not agree with this assessment. They seem to insist that they can overcome the various difficulties posed by the objective factors like sanctions and COVID-19 through the subjective means such as establishing an economic plan, using science and technology, laying down firm rules for all party members, and reinforcing the ideological beliefs of its people. The regime has said that it does not need anyone else's help, and has emphasized that, and they will rely on their own efforts to solve the problems. It is very unfortunate that North Korea seems to show little interest in improving the external relations and easing economic sanctions and securing the medical supplies it needed to overcome COVID-19. North Korea is only insisting on mobilizing its internal resources as a breakthrough out of its difficult situation. From our point of view, it is not impossible for North Korea to improve the external environment. With the recent ROK-US summit meeting in Washington, a new momentum seems to be made to reactivate the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. So this seems, this means that North Korea is granted a new opportunity if it seizes the opportunity and engages in dialogue. Then the objective condition that have troubled the situation for North Korea can be improved. For that matter, it is very important and imperative that we need more and a better understanding of North Korea so that we can persuade North Korea to come to the negotiating table. So this is the beginning of our engagement. We must learn that it is what is the North Korea's goal, and we must also understand why North Korea is avoiding dialogue with the US or even South Korea. This is not an easy task, however. Through the analysis and discussions of renowned experts today, it will not be impossible to understand what North Korea is thinking and what is the political and the socio-economic conditions are at play within the North Korea. Once again, I would like to express my gratitude to all the experts from home and abroad who are participating in today's meeting. Thank you very much.
Dr. Kim for the insightful opening remarks. Now let us begin the session on the topic Understanding North Korea, its necessities and constraints. But first of all, let me introduce our moderator, Dr. Kim. Dr. Ki-jung Kim is the president of the Institute for National Security Strategy. Before joining the institute, he taught as a professor at Yonsei University. And Dr. Kim also served as a policy advisor for the Korean government, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Unification, and National Defense. I will now hand over the mic to Dr. Kim. Please give him a big round of applause.
Hello again.
안녕.
I'm working as the moderator of this session. We have Understanding North Korea, and the subtitle of the session is that what is North Korea's situation in terms of necessity and what is constraint of their nation, inside or outside. So we have 4 themes, and we have 5 the panelists. I would like to introduce the 5 panelists. First speaker is that Professor Bierstecker, at Castello Professor of Emeritus at the Graduate Institute at Geneva. And the second speaker is Professor Hacker. He is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford University. And the third speaker is Dr. Hudakova. She's working as a postdoctoral researcher at Shanxpo. And fourth speaker is Professor Smith. She's working as professional research association in Korean studies at the University of London, and she's also the Professor Emeritus in International Security at Cranfield University. Lastly, Dr. Gibbon Park, who is the faculty member at the Harvard Medical School, and he is well-known expert in NGO who visited North Korea more than 20 times. So we all welcome you. And I would like to set our session like this. I'll give you 10 minutes each, for each theme. So try not to exceed 10 minutes because we have a limited time. So shall we start with the Professor Hacker? You're expert in denuclearization. So tell us about what is going on inside with regard to the denuclearization things. Dr. Hacker?
Sig, you're not muted.
Okay, let's see how that works. So, I said, thank you for the invitation. Good morning and good evening also to all of you. So my first response is, I wish I knew what was going on in North Korea today. But what I was asked to address was to revisit the nuclear question. And I was told to look at the facts and the myths. And so I will do that. But I also added on my own uncertainties, because that we have much greater uncertainties than we have facts or myths. So let me start first by saying, look, the facts in terms of the nuclear program are very difficult to come by. So I base my views and my analysis on the fact that I have been in North Korea 7 times. I visited nuclear facilities at Yongbyon 4 times, and I've talked to the nuclear experts essentially doing each of these visits. So I think the first thing we can start out with, we know that North Korea can build a bomb. And the reason that we know that is they've made the ground shake 6 times. So they've done 6 nuclear tests from 2006 to 2017. And these are anywhere from, let's say, Hiroshima, Nagasaki size, which is an enormous nuclear explosion, to the one in 2017 that seems to be 10 times as powerful. We know that they can launch missiles, anything from short range to intercontinental range. And I think it's also fair, I would call that a fact, that the US North Korea policies, at least of the last 3 administrations over the last 20 years, have failed terribly. And the way I like to point that out is I just take a look at sort of the best estimate of what was the nuclear capability at the end of these administrations. So going back farther than that to Clinton administration, at the end of Clinton administration in 2000, I estimate that North Korea had no nuclear weapons. At the end of the Bush administration in 2008, and of course the Bush administration was the one that walked away from an agreed framework, I believe North Korea had enough nuclear materials, bomb fuel, for 4 to 6 nuclear weapons, and they had tested 1. At the end of the Obama administration in 2016, they had on the order of enough nuclear material for 25 nuclear weapons. At the end of the Trump administration, 4 years later, they had enough for most likely around 45 nuclear weapons. So here, where these 3 administrations all said, we won't let North Korea get the bomb, or if they do, we'll denuclearize, we have failed. Also, actually, much of their nuclear program is indigenous, although without question, they have had important outside help. And actually, they've had more help on the missile end than they've had on the nuclear end. And I think we can also call it a fact that they have exported missiles, missile technologies to countries in the Middle East North Africa, and South Asia. They've also exported nuclear technologies to Libya and to Syria, namely building a plutonium production reactor in Syria that was bombed by the Israelis in 2007. So that's about as far as I would go with facts. The myths, these I find are deeply ingrained, and I talk mostly here of sort of the myth on the American side. So the most prevalent myth about North Korea is that it's violated every nuclear accord it's ever signed. And so in other words, one says that North Korea has cheated on every agreement. It's also accused of having exercised a cycle of provocation, extortion, and reward. That's in essence why they have done diplomacy. And they really have never been genuinely interested in diplomacy. I call those myths because I don't believe they're true, and they're also not helpful. They let Washington off the hook too easily, and it stops them from an introspection to actually find out, look, what really went wrong? So instead of those myths, what I posit is that what Pyongyang has done, and this is through all the Kims, all three of them, it's followed a dual track strategy of nuclear development plus diplomacy. And that it's actually conducted those in parallel. So as I look back for the 30 years now, they've conducted those policies in parallel, but they would alternate which one had higher priority depending on the external circumstances, namely what the United States was doing and maybe what China was doing, but also domestic issues. And I also say that North Korea actually has had serious interest in diplomacy. And that was certainly the case for Kim Il-sung when, as the Cold War ended, he decided to explore a long-term strategic accommodation with the United States because he felt that that was the best path to survival given the dramatic geopolitical changes. And that is, of course, Soviet Union falling apart and China taking other routes such as its economic climb. And so he actually viewed at that time that perhaps Washington was a better bet than sticking with Russia and China. And then at least as I've studied over the years, I believe Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un also have shown at times that they're seriously interested in diplomacy. And particularly Kim Jong-il in 2000, when Vice Marshal Cho came to the White House, when Madeleine Albright came to Pyongyang, it was clear that they had a serious interest. Of course, that was dashed with the incoming of the Bush administration. In 2005, when after the six-party talks had gotten some steam, they signed a September 19th, 2005 joint statement for normalization of relations, denuclearization, and all of that. I also believe at that particular time, they thought that diplomacy might work. In 2011, Kim Jong-il, once again, after it turns out in 2005, the joint statement was essentially abrogated by the United States almost at the time before the ink was dry. And so North Korea walked away from that. They did a nuclear test in 2006. Bush administration tried some diplomacy in 2007 and 8. But then in 2011, Kim Jong-il was again serious about diplomacy, most likely to sort of smooth the transition of succession to his son. And negotiations started toward what eventually became the Leap Day deal in February 29, 2012, which was actually consummated by his son, Kim Jong-un. And so at that time, being really just new in control, he went through with that. And then they also launched a satellite. Obama administration walked away from that deal, and it all fell through. I think Kim Jong-un tried again in 2015 in January when he made an offer for a nuclear test moratorium that was turned down. And then in 2018, certainly the more and more I've studied, the more I've seen of his interaction with President Trump, particularly through the letters, again, there was serious diplomacy. So just a couple of more quick myths, at least as far as I'm concerned. China can solve the North Korea problem. Well, I think that's a big myth. And it's certainly, whereas Beijing certainly can put pressure on Pyongyang, but they don't have absolute control, nor is it interested in resolving the North Korea problem for the benefit of the United States itself. The next one is sanctions are an effective way to curtail North Korea's nuclear advances. I'll let my colleague speakers actually convince you of that, and that is Thomas and Susanna. And so the one more that I will mention, which was particularly important at the Hanoi summit, and I call that a myth, and that is that the Yongbyon nuclear complex, which was being offered up, is old and obsolete. It is certainly, some of it is somewhat old, but it is most certainly not obsolete. Okay, then let me just say that on the issue of uncertainties, I would say the uncertainties essentially lurk everywhere.
Dr. Ecker, just make it brief.
Just about at the 10-minute mark, so yes. Let me just say, all right, if I may have 2 more minutes.
All right.
Thank you. Let me just say that uncertainties are exactly how much fissile materials the bomb fuel does North Korea have. And particularly when it comes to highly enriched uranium, that's very uncertain. The only person that's ever been in their enrichment facility is myself, along with my Stanford colleagues. There are many uncertainties about the sophistication of those nuclear weapons. Do they really have hydrogen bombs? What about the safety? What about their experience? How much of a state of readiness are those nuclear weapons? What is their nuclear doctrine? Who has launch authority? You know, what happens if indeed Kim is incapacitated? What does North Korea consider to be tactical nuclear weapons? They've talked about these. Do they have battlefield nuclear weapons? We don't know. Does Pyongyang actually consider its conventional and chemical weapons to be a deterrent? Does it have a nuclear-tipped ICBM that could reach the United States? I say no, but there's certainly some uncertainty associated with that. There are currently uncertainties about what's actually going on inside of Yongbyon, what's working, what's not working, and then also what's outside of Yongbyon. The biggest uncertainty is, will Kim Jong-un give up his nuclear weapons? And to that I say, I don't know. And I don't think he does either, because it depends how everything evolves around him. So I spell all of that out in the papers we were asked to write. So I would finish by saying the uncertainties are enormous. They can only be reduced, in my opinion, if the US government engages Pyongyang in a meaningful stepwise process, to halt, roll back, and then eliminate North Korea's nuclear program. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ecker. Thank you very much. We all know that North Korea problem, simply put, maybe the structure characteristic of the so-called North Korean problem is that security and economy is intertwinedly. It is dilemma situation. You know, it is called the vicious cycle. That if they want to secure the security, but their economy would be more in trouble. So there is this vicious cycle between the security economy dilemma. In between that security and economy, the so-called sanction regime is working. So the next guester we'd like to invite is that 2 speakers, Dr. Bierstecker and Huda Kober. You were sharing the 10 minutes, right? So 5 minutes each? Okay, please.
Right, let me begin by sharing my screen and putting up the PowerPoint slideshow, playing from the start. And we've been given the daunting task of trying to answer the question, are sanctions working? And I know many people have strong opinions about this. Many people probably already know or think they know the answer to this. What we're going to do is, what I'm doing is collaborating with my colleague, Susanna Hudakova from Sciences Po in Paris. And we are the joint developers, along with another colleague, of something called UN Sanctions App. And we're going to draw very heavily on the material in the app itself in our presentation, because we make annual assessments of the effectiveness of United Nations sanctions. United Nations sanctions are, of course, particularly relevant in the case of North Korea, because it is the principal source of sanctions, and they can be effective at times when they are implemented. So what we're going to do is basically talk about the complexity of evaluating sanctions effectiveness. Now, the conventional wisdom about sanctions is that, well, they've been in place. UN sanctions have been in place now since 2006 for 15 years. This is, in fact, the most extensive United Nations sanctions regime in place of the 15 ongoing UN sanctions regimes today. It's approximating comprehensive sanctions measures, and it's accompanied by US and EU autonomous measures as well. Yet, North Korea continues to develop its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Therefore, sanctions are not working. That is, I think, the conventional wisdom. But is it really this simple? I think it's a little bit more complicated. What I'm going to do in the first half of the presentation is talk about how we think about the evaluation of the effectiveness of sanctions. And then my colleague, Susanna Hudakova, will join me to conclude the presentation on when we apply this framework to looking in detail at the 8 episodes of sanctions undertaken by the UN since 2006. So the outline is also just a framework for evaluating sanctions effectiveness. Susanna Hudakova will apply it systematically to assess different combinations of sanctions imposed on North Korea. She'll describe the complexity of the measures, assess the varying effectiveness over time, and will conclude with a reminder about why sanctions were originally imposed and a little bit of reflection on the alternatives to sanctions. So how to think about sanctions effectiveness. There are basically 5 points I want to emphasize here. Sanctions have multiple purposes, not just to change behavior. Not all sanctions regimes are the same. There's tremendous variation in the combinations of measures applied over time. Sanctions effectiveness is a function, we argue, of 2 variables. First, the policy outcome, what changed on the ground, and second, what's the sanctions contribution to that outcome. Fourth, implementation is vital. You can't have effectiveness if the sanctions are not implemented. We could come back to that in the question and answer perhaps. And impact, some kind of impact on the target are necessary to make a claim of effectiveness. So let me elaborate on this. First, on purposes. Most people focus on sanctions' ability to force a change in behavior. But most sanctions regimes have simultaneously multiple purposes. That is not only to coerce, but also to constrain and to signal targets and others about certain behavior. The purpose of sanctions on North Korea, now we're drawing directly from our app, is 1, to coerce DPRK to denuclearize and return to the NPT. Second, constrain DPRK from developing nuclear and missile technology programs. And third, send a normative signal to DPRK and others in support of the non-proliferation regime. Variation of sanctions is, as I said at the outset, not all sanctions regimes are the same. There's a significant variety in types and combinations of sanctions in place over time. There are individual, sectoral, and economic activity sanctions. There are also differences between those measures that are mandatory, recommended, or conditional, and different combinations are applied and change over time. So it's not like we can simply say sanctions yes, sanctions no. There are different combinations and they vary over time. Therefore, we evaluate sanctions effectiveness within discrete episodes, different combinations of sanctions measures in place at any given time. Implementation is required for effectiveness. Impacts must be visible. But at all times, other policy instruments should be taken into consideration. So therefore, it's not just the presence of sanctions. There are negotiations, there are threats of force, there's the use of force, there are covert activities that need to be considered. So sanctions are operating not in a vacuum or on their own. It's not the only policy tool being applied. And in answering the question about effectiveness, we have to answer the counterfactual question of what would likely have happened in the absence of sanctions. And when we make our evaluations, we go through a procedure of looking at all other instruments at play, and we ask ourselves this counterfactual question before we make an assessment of the effectiveness. Only then can you make an argument about sanctions effectiveness. Now, in transition, I'm just going to make a brief comment. Some of you have seen me make this, I think, at a previous JEJU forum, but sanctions effectiveness in this case, it's the least likely case that we should have effectiveness, because coercing change in behavior is difficult in the best of circumstances. Constraint is less challenging, but increasing cost doesn't necessarily lead to major cuts in prescribed activities. So with its history of self-reliant development, JEJU sanctions are more effective, we know, on more highly integrated economies. North Korea is one of the least integrated economies in the world, and the nature of the state is one of the last remaining command economies. So this is a least likely case of sanctions effectiveness. But let me turn the screen over to my colleague, Susanna Hudakova. And I guess I stop sharing and Susanna starts. So.
Thank you, Dr. Biostecker. And then, yeah, and we also invite the Dr. Hudakova.
Thank you very much. Let me provide a brief history of UN sanctions on DPRK and how and to what degree they worked. Sanctions on DPRK, UN sanctions on DPRK were originally threatened in July 2006 after ballistic missile launches by DPRK, which were the first time in 8 years, basically ending the 8-year moratorium. This happened after DPRK withdrew from the NPT treaty in 2003, and after it suspended its participation in talks. So the first round of sanctions was imposed in reaction to the first nuclear test conducted by North Korea. The types of sanctions that were imposed involved limits on arms, proliferation items, goods, luxury goods, and formally asset freezes and travel bans, but these were left without designees at the time during this period between 2006 and 2019. And the outcome was mixed. Coercion, DPRK returned to talks during this time, allowed IAEA inspections, shut down the Yongbyon plutonium plant, but by and large, there was, in the end of the episode, a failure to reach an agreement, and there was a downward spiral. So the constraint during this period was ineffective, primarily because the sanctions were weakly implemented during this time to incentivize DPRK return to the six-party talks. And the signaling of sanctions themselves was mixed because the diplomacy was actually doing much of the signaling. So the second round of sanctions was imposed in 2009 in response to the long-range missile launch and the second nuclear test of North Korea. The first individual designations were made, arms embargo expanded, and other restrictions such as on bunkering ban was added. The outcome once again is mixed. Coercion became ineffective. North Korea continued with with the prescribed activities. However, the constraint became mixed during this period because evasion became more difficult. And talks continued, so the signaling stayed mixed. Episode 3 starts with the third nuclear test. So in reaction to the third nuclear test of DPRK, proliferation ban is expanded. There are new conditional measures, including on the financial sector. And outcome once again is mixed. Coercion and constraint are ineffective. North Korea continues its activities. But the signaling of sanctions becomes effective as it becomes the primary signal because of the talks no longer being so much part of the issue. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go very quickly. The fourth episode, this is after the first 10 years where sanctions were quite limited and tried to target more the elite. From 2016, we observe a broadening of sanctions, significant broadening of sanctions in really fast succession between 2016 and 17. And it happens in reaction to DPRK nuclear activity. So the fourth episode is in reaction to the fourth nuclear test. We see commodity export restrictions on coal, more financial and transportation sanctions, and the outcome remains ineffective for coercion and constraint, but effective in signaling. North Korea is increasingly isolated internationally. Fifth nuclear test sparks the fifth episode with the coal caps, new commodity restrictions, diplomatic restrictions, and once again, we see the same effectiveness. Episode 6 is sparked by the ICBM missile launches. Again, sanctions are expanded, including work authorization, seafood exports ban, etc. And the effectiveness remains largely the same as before. After the sixth nuclear test, the largest one, sanctions are again expanded. There's new restrictions, including a ban on condensates, petroleum exports, caps on crude oil, textile export ban. And here we see that after the broadening of sanctions, and especially after China started implementing the sanctions, we see the constraint has increased on DPRK because it became much harder to generate income for the country. And then we come to the last episode, episode 8, which started in 2017 in response to the ICBM launch, and once again broadened the sanctions even further with new commodity imports and exports bans. And here, what's very interesting, for the first time, we have an overall ineffective episode, because the coercion and constraint remain ineffective and the signaling weakened slightly in reaction to not only the diplomatic activity that happened during this period, but also the increased division in the Security Council regarding whether sanctions on DPRK should be eased following the unilateral moratorium that DPRK imposed on its activities, and following the diplomatic successes. So let me just finish, leave you with a little bit of an overview. We are not arguing that sanctions on North Korea are effective, but we're also saying that simply saying that they're ineffective misses crucial parts of the story. It misses the mixed effectiveness on coercion, for example, that took place in the first episode. It misses parts where North Korea was constrained in its activity to a certain degree during episodes 2 and 7. And it also misses the normative signaling aspect of sanctions. And so overall, in our evaluations, depending on what you're looking at, the whole episode can be considered mixed, with the exception of the current one. And I'll let Tom briefly conclude. Thank you.
I really don't have very much to add. In fact, by way of conclusion, Susanna's already made the most important points about the variation over time, the complexity. It's more complex than generally acknowledged. And just go to the end. We just want to conclude that, no, go back, sorry, that we should recall why sanctions are being imposed. You can see very much this dynamic between actions and reactions going back and forth. It's very much a tit-for-tat arrangement. And our conclusion really is recalibrate the measures, don't simply abandon them, because the sanctions can be utilized as I've argued elsewhere. They can be useful in negotiations by exchanging forms of sanctions relief for concrete steps in denuclearization. So I think that's where we should shift the attention, rather than simply blaming sanctions for everything that's happening and wrong. There are many things that are happening and wrong. Don't simply abandon them, but try to use them strategically, constructively in support of a larger denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bielsteker and Dr. Fudakova. So you're saying is that sanctions to North Korea, sometimes it is working, sometimes it's not. So it is, so as Fudakova mentioned, that it is a mixed outcome. So, but sometimes it is a self-fulfilling, a signal or even political slogan. When certain countries decide to apply the sanctions to a certain country. But one thing, in the case of DPRK, the one thing sure that we can observe is that the sanction is closely related to the North Korean, political beliefs of self-reliance. And this self-reliance is also closely related with the food problems in the North Korea. So I'd like to invite Dr. Hager-Smith to talk about the food crisis or food problems in North Korea. Dr. Smith?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, and thank you to the JEJU Forum for organizing this today. In my short 10 minutes, I'd like to, as Dr. Kim says, focus on food security and food shortages in North Korea. And the reason for doing this is that the overall rubric of this panel is about understanding North Korea and also trying to explain in some ways what's happening both in relationship to the government and to the people, the population, which are by no means the same thing in North Korea. Also, there's hardly anything more necessary if we're talking about necessities than having enough food to eat. The other interesting thing for us to bear in mind as analysts is that unlike the famine years of the 1990s, when nearly 500,000 people died from the best research we have, and we today have plenty of information about very specific sectors related to food security in North Korea. Unlike the 1990s, today we've got a lot of very good, reliable information about agriculture, food supply, demography, and nutrition in North Korea, longitudinal information, which gives us a lot more tools to work with as analysts than we had in the 1990s. I worked in North Korea for a couple of years in the 1990s, and I was on secondment to UNICEF and the World Food Programme in the middle of the famine, and we were there working with a completely blank slate. It's very, very different today. Now, what that means is although we don't have direct access to North Korea today, nobody's really been able to get in, including UN officials for the last 18 months or so because of COVID restrictions and these sanctions. It's not true to say that we don't have any information, that we can't make reasoned, evidence-based assessments of what's going on in North Korea. We know, for instance, as a complete fact, that since 2018, North Korea hasn't been able to produce enough food to feed its population, where it was more or less doing so for the previous 15 years. We also have enough information to tell us that famine conditions are probably prevalent in parts of North Korea. They could be very extensive in North Korea this year. And I want to go through in the short time I have 2 reasons for why famine has re-emerged in North Korea. And one is a proximate cause, and that's related to external factors. And the other is an underlying cause, which is related to domestic factors in North Korea. And I would stress that this is a simplification, but nevertheless, because I've got 10 minutes, because it's a simplification, I still think that it's, which is what analysis does actually, that it's worth thinking through what these key issues are. Now, the first and proximate cause, and probably this is very well known to this audience today, is the change in the UN sanctions regime in 2016, which has already been alluded to. Before 2016, the UN sanctions regime was targeted at the military and the defense sector, government institutions and officials. It was very broadly targeted, but it was mainly targeted at people and institutions that had direct relationships with the nuclear program. Now, in 2016, the UN sanctions regime changed. It reverted to something more like the regime we'd seen against Haiti in the 90s and against Iraq in the early 2000s. In other words, the sanctions regime targeted the civilian economy. It didn't discriminate between the military and the civilian economy from 2016 onwards. Now, what that did for food production was pretty both straightforward and extreme, especially the 2017 sanctions, which banned all natural gas, which are essential for food production, going to North Korea, and implemented a very severe cap on oil exports going to North Korea. Now, what this means for agriculture is that oil everywhere in the world, whether it's a rich country or a poor country, is a non-substitutable commodity for food production, whether it's in the US or in North Korea. And North Korea, unlike other countries that have been sanctioned, has no indigenous oil supplies. Now, UN sanctions already, because they widely interpreted the dual use provisions, had stopped exports of agricultural equipment to North Korea. And effectively, the 2017 oil sanctions inflicted a coup de grace on agricultural production in North Korea. After 2017, not surprisingly, harvests plummeted and they've never recovered. And the country could not produce sufficient food to feed its 25 million population. And when we're talking about sufficient food, we're talking about literally sufficient food. We're not talking about not having enough food to have choices in supermarkets. We're talking about not having sufficient food, and most North Koreans get their food from domestic food production, to feed a third of the country's 25 million people at basic rations. Now, we shouldn't be surprised at that, because the intention of UN sanctions, the 2016 and 17 sanctions, was to degrade the civilian economy, and about a third of the civilian economy, however it's measured, is in agriculture. So that was the first and proximate cause of where we are today with food shortages, severe food shortages. The underlying cause is what I call in the paper that I've done for this session, is the institutionalized denial of empirical reality by the North Korean government. What I mean by this, and in the short time I can, I'll try to elaborate, is that the North Korean government's overall economic policies are founded on the claim that it's self-sufficient economically. We all know this. But what is perhaps less often taken into account is that whereas once this claim to self-reliance and self-sufficiency was more a policy aspiration from the 50s onwards, 1950s onwards, that has changed now from a policy aspiration to an assertion of economic reality, to an assertion of ideological belief. Empirically, what this means is that all economic policy in North Korea is based and cannot be challenged, because the assumption is an ideological belief, is based on the assertion that all the economic requirements that North Korea needs can be resourced from within the boundaries of North Korea. What that means is that the dependencies that I've just mentioned, the oil dependencies which North Korea has, are not acknowledged. It's not that they're simply underplayed, they're not acknowledged. And I've got a lot of documentation on this from North Korean scientists internally, and I'd be very happy to share that with anybody who's interested in this. Now, the practical consequence of this denial of empirical reality is that when government ideology, and this is an ideological claim now, comes up against the real reality, the empirical reality that people face every day, the government in practice has to turn to the only factor of production in economic terms that it has available to fill economic gaps, and that's the human labor of the population. Now, those economists with you, but you don't need to be an economist to imagine this, that given the physical and limited, inherently limited capacity of the human being, this, what I call labor fallacy, both increases the physical work burden on the population and simply cannot, without technology, which North Korea does not have, or much of it, it cannot increase productivity, and it certainly cannot replace oil imports in agriculture in any area of the economy, actually, including agriculture. And so this policy of denying empirical reality is cause and consequence also of the endemic labor shortages which occur in every sector of the economy. This is not China as before the change to marketization, because China had lots of surplus labor from the country that it could release. North Korea is not in that position. Now, that's a situation, this denial of economic reality and this reliance on physical labor, where in normal times, North Korea is a very poor country, so in the normal times when North Korea is poor, North Korea can muddle through. It can't do much more than survive, but it can muddle through. But in times of acute economic crisis, particularly those provided by external factors over which it has little or no control, or in external factors which it has difficulties in responding to, What that means is more and more is demanded of individuals at a time when they have fewer resources, either of food or physical energy or psychological resilience. And this year, or since 2019, since the reduction in harvests, the situation is exactly that. The government is demanding more and more from the adult workforce. You see that adult workers are forced to participate in mass mobilizations as well as engaging in their normal work. And additionally, in 2021, in a sign of absolute desperation by the government this year, there's been a change of policy internally. North Korea has always prided itself on keeping children in school. Admittedly, they've come out to operate in harvests and transplanting before, but the school system has actually been very good and girls and boys have been in attendance. This year, North Korea's the government's making announcements to say that 16 and 17-year-olds are being brought into the adult workforce to work in very physically tough workplaces. And this signifies that the North Korean government is really running out of economic options. There are certain advantages to North Korea's policy for the government. And again, I would stress that there is a difference between the government and the population. And we should think about that when we're thinking about what we should be doing or thinking about as outsiders in understanding North Korea. There's a difference between understanding the North Korean government and understanding the population. For the government, the mantra of self-sufficiency has a lot of political advantages. It allows the government to shift the blame for economic failure away from its policy decisions. If it's true, for instance, that North Korea is self-sufficient, and if it's true, as the North Korean ideology says, that it can undertake any economic task whatsoever because of the boundless creativity of human beings, then the only explanation for economic failure must be that it is insufficiently prepared ideologically officials or insufficiently enthusiastic workers engaging in their economic tasks. So the answer has been this year, and this happened in the 1990s until the famine just overwhelmed all these approaches, is that workers must be asked to do more and more and more.
Dr. Smith?
Now, my big problem, and I'm going to summarize now, the question I'd leave you with is, why hasn't there been more international attention paid to this ongoing food crisis, similar to what we saw in the 1990s? Well, in 2019 and 20, there's a lot of evidence that China provided massive amounts of food aid. We don't know if that's happened this year, which is in itself an indication that there was a food crisis in the first place. And secondly, we have a very awkward alliance of interest. We have the UN and the member states, including my own, the UK, which really do not want to own the responsibility for starving North Korean children, which is the direct result of the sanctions of 2017. Because what they did is that they implemented oil sanctions, which are the same which provided the same conditions as we had in the famine of the 1990s, when Russia and China stopped oil exports to North Korea, and then we had famine in the 1990s. And also the North Korean leadership refuses to expose the extent of its vulnerabilities, either to its own population or to its adversaries. So we end up with a situation where it's in nobody's interest to expose what happened, what's happening right now and the reasons for it. And as I say, the theme of this panel is understanding the reasons why we are where we are. We could, as South Korea could, the UK could, the US did, if it wanted, it could suspend the 2017 sanctions without suspending the entire sanctions regime, which in my view would be a sensible reaction and an ethical reaction to what's going on now. Of course, the North Korean government is responsible for the welfare of its people, but we also have a responsibility for the actions that are taken in our name through the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Last speaker we'd like to invite is Dr. Park from Harvard University. Dr. Park, as I mentioned in my opening address, that in recent South Korean American, to leaders summit meeting in Washington, that we here in South Korean is sensing that maybe it is a time to reactivate the peace process, just like the 2018, because the one sentence we can notice, it is very much noticeable sentence that United States is going to support South Korea's cooperation, dialogue, and engagement toward North Korea. So, so this is, we interpret in this way. Maybe this is the time to design or apply the, joint engagement towards North Korea. Joint engagement means that we mean that, on the basis of cooperation of the South Korea and the United States. So maybe, this is the questions that I like to ask you, but you have already provided that your talking point. If we design to initiate the so-called engagement to North Korea, is that the health engagement would be a good card, good signal to North Korea? So tell us about your opinion about the health engagement to North Korea. I'll give you 10 minutes.
Thank you, President Kim. Yeah, I mean, we're living in a pandemic right now, and the principle of pandemic control is no one is safe until we're all safe, and our security is as good as the weakest link. And this means adversaries, traditional adversaries, actually have to put down their guns and work together, so that it's in the interest of everyone to work together. So I think cooperation with North Korea, beginning with pandemic cooperation, makes perfect sense. Whether or not it opens up other opportunities for diplomacy, it all depends on how that's done. So let me just give you some background on the way the North Koreans are thinking. I love the way Dr. Sig Hecker went through the facts and myths, and maybe I'll debunk some myths as well. So, North Korea sees the pandemic threat, COVID-19 threat, and the response to it as a matter of national survival. This is, it's managed at a high level above even the Ministry of Public Health. And they have actually applied a whole of government, an aggressive and highly efficient implementation of their strategy, which is to prevent the virus from coming into the country in the first place. So the myth is, people say, oh, when North Korea says, hey, they must have, we have no cases of COVID in our country. And most people will say, well, that cannot be, they're lying. Well, I would like to challenge that and say, wait a minute, listen, they're one of the first countries to actually close its borders, sealed it actually, right? And aggressive public health measures at a steep cost to their economy. And I think their public health measures are so strong that I think they were able to successfully keep the virus out of the country. Now, there's some evidence, if you will, that they're demonstrating some confidence that they were able to achieve this. And they are these large public gatherings, right? Some of these big events where many people are gathering in one place, sometimes with no mask, and obviously with the elites of the government in the same place. So I think it's more likely than not they were able to prevent it. Could there have been small outbreaks someplace and there was immediately quarantined and sealed off? It's possible. But the other fact is that North Korea has very limited testing capacity. They have probably 15 to 20 machines to conduct these PCR testing throughout the whole country. So they may not be able to test everyone that they want to test. So when they say we have no confirmed cases of COVID-19 in their country, they may actually be telling the truth. Now, I will tell you that the country, even though they may get high marks in preventing the virus from coming into the country and protecting its population, it's had steep costs to the society. And these are what we call the indirect costs as a result of the policies that they have instituted. And this is increasing poverty, degradation of health systems due to supply chain issues, loss of essential health services, and then of course, all humanitarian assistance is now halted. And I think these things will cause actual, what we call excess deaths to mount, and this will mount every year. And this is so unsustainable, and from my point of view, that North Korea remains in this isolated state. And then that brings us to, the path to reopen. What will it take? It's no secret that North Korea has indicated their interest in gaining access to these vaccines. There's no question about that. So let's talk about what are the best ways for North Korea to access them. Well, everybody knows by now the COVAX facility. This is an attempt to bring access to COVAX vaccines to the poorest countries in the world. There's one program called Advanced Market Commitment. And this is basically a donor-driven program, and COVAX aims to provide sufficient vaccines for these poor countries to vaccinate up to 20% of their population. When this program was announced, North Korea immediately filled out the application because they're eligible, and they submitted the application in time, and they were approved. And it's no surprise because Gavi, one of the partners of the COVAX facility, the Global Vaccine Alliance, they've been working in North Korea for almost 2 decades. They have a good relationship with them. And of course, the other partner is WHO, and they have an in-country office as well. So they were approved for the vaccines, and they were required to submit a national vaccination deployment plan. And that was submitted on time and also approved. So there's been some reports that North Korea is not being cooperative with the COVAX. I think that's not really an accurate statement. There was the vaccine that they were allocated was the AstraZeneca vaccine. And when the side effects were starting to show up, North Korea wrote a letter to the COVAX and said, hey, we're concerned about these side effects. Tell us more about that. I think that's completely expected. My understanding is that they were allocated almost 2 million doses to be delivered as early as this past February, but that was on hold because of the source, a supplier is India. Serum Institute of India, and they ran into their own surges, which forced the government to put a moratorium on exports of all of their vaccines. So from the COVAX standpoint, North Korea will be getting the vaccine allotment, but it's been delayed. It's a supply issue, and then there's some technical aspects such as enhancing their cold chain capabilities. It'll need to be upgraded somewhat. So that there are a couple of obviously technical questions that come up that has to do with vaccination. One has to do with, can they vaccinate their entire population in North Korea? Absolutely. They have got ongoing vaccination programs that date back, decades, and they get high rates of vaccines, especially for children, 97, 98% national vaccination rates. That's been verified by WHO and UNICEF. So they know how to do that. Next question, do they have the cold chain, the infrastructure to store and transport these vaccines in the temperatures that are required? At least for the AstraZeneca vaccine, absolutely. The vaccines that they're currently using for UNICEF and Gavi require identical cold chain temperatures, simple refrigeration. So they have all that in place. And the last time I spoke with the Gavi people, they think that North Korea, once they are provided with the vaccines, they can vaccinate the entire country within 4 to 6 months. That's what because they're super efficient in getting these things done. Now, so there's a delay right now in the shipment of vaccines. And then since the application was accepted and the allocation was announced, 2 other vaccines actually have been approved by the WHO. So North Korea has trust WHO, trust WHO to certify these vaccines, and they have certified recently the 2 Chinese vaccines. So it's possible that North Korea can access these two vaccines bilaterally, going outside of the COVAX facility. And then if the Russian vaccine, the Sputnik V vaccine, gets approved by the WHO, that's another option for them as well. Now, let me just talk a little bit about potential for engagement with South Korea, and then now with the US. For South Korea, so let me just go back up a little bit. North Korea wants vaccines, South Korea wants to provide vaccines, and US is willing to provide vaccines and money towards COVAX facility and AMC, which they know North Korea is one of the recipients. So I think all the puzzles of the pieces are there. It just has to be put together in the right package. For South Korea, I can see with the South Korea strong vaccine manufacturing and development system. North Korea would love to be part of that effort, the regional vaccine hub, because I think North Korea wants to be seen. I think they have the capacity to actually manufacture vaccines as well. So that might be one area that could be a place for inter-Korea cooperation. And for the US, I think they're on the right track by providing funding for COVAX facility. They have enough money now for up to 20% of the population in low-income countries. And they are providing now 500 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine through COVAX. What only thing the US will need to do is to tell COVAX, make sure North Korea is eligible and they get their allocated share like everybody else. They just wanted to be treated like everybody else. And that's the key here, not that they won't be restricted or singled out from the from their eligibility, because in the past, that's what's happened. So that's like a first step towards building a goodwill, and then hopefully getting North Korea to start considering how to reopen the country so that humanitarian groups can re-enter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Park. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have precisely 8 minutes left, and we should, finish up our session in 8 minutes. It is not negotiable, So I'd like to ask you a very simple question to each of you, except Dr. Park, sorry. Because speaking of engagement, we all agree that engagement is not rewarding something to North Korea. Engagement is a strategy by which we can induce North Korea and make North Korea stay on the framework of the commitment. So we, as I mentioned, that we try to locate something that outset of our approach to North Korea. What do we what do we put something on the entrance on the dialogue with North Korea? So in terms of security, Dr. Hacker, give us just simple one word that what should we consider as engagement strategy in terms of security or denuclearization to North Korea?
I think the Biden administration, in its policy review, has put the right pieces together, and that is, in essence, to understand they're not going to give up all the nuclear weapons first. One has to do this in a stepwise process. And so that's the right idea. What I'd like to see is a lot of energy behind that, and that's not so clear right now as to whether it has sufficiently high priority. And I think the US also needs to find out is what is North Korea willing to do? As I had mentioned, I thought all 3 Kims showed serious interest in diplomacy at some time. Kim Jong-un showed that in 2018. They have to find out, where is he today? Can one get back to the sort of office he made in 2018? If so, then I think the Biden team has the right approach as to how to engage and involve them in that process. Thank you.
Dr. Pierce-Taker, you mentioned that sanctions should be recalibrated. Recalibrated sanction approach could be a good initiating engagement strategy to North Korea. What do you think?
Yes, I do think that we need to think about how sanctions can be used more strategically for the goals that initially motivated the application of the measures in the first place. And my current research is mainly focused on, and also along with Susanna, is looking at varieties and forms of sanctions relief and how they can be linked to what Sig referred to as the step-by-step approach to an engagement strategy. And I do think that that Key Park's presentation about the health engagement, that's a very, very good first step that can be taken on not only on humanitarian grounds, but it also it sends a signal. And these kinds of gestures of goodwill or confidence building measures at the outset are very important for trying to create a basis for trust and subsequent engagement on other issues. And then there are many other things that can be done with exemptions, with an easing of exemptions. I think the Biden administration has changed it, certainly has moved away from the Trump administration's failed maximum pressure approach. And one can go further along the line. But one has to calibrate these measures. I mean, Hazel Smith suggested a suspension on the petroleum, which is, in some ways, it's an interesting, I can go on about that, I won't at this point, because it's to some extent, it's being relaxed already by non-implementation by both Russia and China. So there are questions about how far that could go, but I think that's the idea of sanctions suspensions should be taken very seriously. That's not an automatic lifting of the measures, but they can be suspended in a time-limited, conditional way, or even open-ended way. So I think there are lots and lots of things that can be done. It just needs to be creatively thought through. Thanks.
Dr. Hudakova, is there anything that you can add? No,
thank you. Maybe also caps as one of the solutions. So all the things that Tom already mentioned, there are very many sanctions in place, which has consequences, but it's also a lot of opportunities for re-engaging North Korea, I think. So there are many things that can be offered, and it will really depend on what's the counter offer, right? So this is the calibration. So there is a lot on the table in principle, and I think that provides a lot of opportunities.
Dr. Smith, so food shortage in the North Korean problem, the humanitarian assistance, including the food to North Korea, would be a good idea for initial engagement to North Korea?
In the late 1990s and in the 2000s, humanitarian assistance, as everybody knows here, was used as part of a negotiating strategy by the United States in the denuclearization talks. And it was successful because North Korea didn't have many other options. Today, substantial, we don't know how much exactly, but there's a lot of evidence that there's been substantial bulk food aid from China. Could be as much as 1 million tons. Now, for those not involved in agriculture, 1 million tons is enough to feed 8 million people for 1 year. Now, that could be possible because China now has very large rice surpluses, and so it has the ability to donate those levels of surpluses, and it could be doing that. That it's definitely donating food, but it could be donating that level of food in order to maintain stability on the Korean Peninsula. If that is the case, then the offering of relatively small amounts, like 50,000 tons, which South Korea offered last year, or even 200,000 tons of food aid, isn't going to get the engagement strategies back on track. So we're in a very, very different negotiating framework than we were in the 1990s. And so, of course, humanitarian aid, and even at the time, that negotiating humanitarian aid in the 1990s as a condition of diplomacy, either directly or indirectly, was a very, very difficult thing to sell because it's verging on illegality in international law to make humanitarian aid, which by definition is necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Thank you. We have, sorry, we are approaching the final minutes. Dr. Park, I'll give you 10 seconds to conclude our session.
Well, this was a great session. I really learned a lot from my other panelists, and yeah, let's start figuring out how to engage with North Korea.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to close our session, and we're going to have 2 more sessions tomorrow under the same theme, Understanding North Korea. So continue to have interest and visit our homepage at INSS. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, and all the discussants for your participation in this meaningful session. 네, 여러분 그럼 잠시 휴식 시간을.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will take a short break, and from 3:20 we will have another session on with the pandemic, changes in industrial environment and sustainable global co-prosperity strategy. Thank you.